everyone. My name is Georgine Chastain, and I'm the president of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's presentation entitled Revisiting the Classics, Immigration and Urbanization, the Slovak Experience, 1870 to 1918, with Professor Mark Stolarik. And it's great to see all of you today in the virtual audience. This will be the last Slovak American Society of Washington virtual program until September. The speakers series will be taking the summer off. So be watching your email or check our website at dcslovaks.org for information on upcoming programs in the fall. I'd like to kindly request now that everyone mute their microphones on their computers, and please keep them muted during the presentation. Feel free to use the chat function during the presentation to ask questions of our speaker. And then after the presentation, we'll open the floor up for questions. As a reminder, this afternoon's presentation is being recorded and will be made available soon on our Slovak American Society YouTube channel. And let's see. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to encourage those who are attending our event for the first time to consider becoming a member. Please visit us at www.dcslovaks.org for more information. And I can put that URL in the chat so you can access it there. Okay. In 1974, the University of Minnesota granted M. Mark Stolarik a Ph.D. for his dissertation, Immigration and Urbanization, the Slovak Experience, 1870 to 1918, which was published under the same title by AMS Press in New York in 1989. Based on thorough archival research in Slovakia and in the US, Professor Stolarik traced the migration of Slovak peasants, largely from villages in eastern Slovakia, in search, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, to the industrial northeast of the US in search of work. There, these immigrants established the three pillars of their communities: fraternal-benefit societies, parish churches, and a thriving newspaper press. With these institutions, they managed to preserve many aspects of their culture through 3 generations of life in the New World. Professor Stolarik specializes in the history of Slovak immigration to North America. He has published 10 books and over 70 articles in scholarly journals on this subject, as well as on Slovak history in general. He taught Slovak history at the University of Ottawa for 30 years until his retirement in 2022. He founded the Slovak Studies Association in 1977. From 1982 until 2021, he edited the scholarly journal Slovakia. Although in retirement, he continues to research Slovak American and Slovak Canadian history, to publish in this field, to present papers at scholarly conferences, and to speak on this subject upon request. And now I'd like to turn over the Zoom microphone to Professor Stolarik.
Hello, everyone. And now I have to do my share screen, so if you'll bear with me, it will be there in a second. Okay, and now I have to make it big, which means I have to go to slideshow and from the beginning. Okay, I presume you now have a large screen.
Yes.
In front of you. Okay, good.
Perfect.
So I'm going to cover the period 1870-1914 and a little bit going up to 1918, but it'll basically end in 1914. And I want to remind all of you that the Slovaks didn't have their own state until 1993. Before that, well, up to 1918, they lived in what was called the Kingdom of Hungary, which itself was part of what was called then, from 1867 on, the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. And as you can see on this map, which shows the ethnic groups, it was a very multicultural empire. It was actually an empire. And in 1867, the ruling Habsburgs basically reached an agreement with the ruling Magyars in the Kingdom of Hungary that they would essentially split the empire among themselves, with the Habsburgs retaining control over the Austrian half. And if you look at the cursor, it was the former province of Galicia, and this one was inhabited by Ukrainians, and here it was inhabited by Poles, and then over here it was Czechs and Moravians and Germans. The Czechs are blue, the Czechs and Moravians are blue. The red is Germans, and also down here in, I guess, gray, those were the Slovenes. And they were part of the Austrian half of the empire, and also Austria controlled what used to be called Bosnia-Herzegovina. They seized that in the late 19th century, so this was also controlled by the Habsburgs from Vienna. And meanwhile, the other half of the empire was the Kingdom of Hungary, and if you look at the cursor, the border was here, like this. I'm tracing the border with the cursor, okay? Going down, and all the way, and that included Croatia, the Kingdom of Croatia. Okay, so that was the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Slovaks were in the northernmost part up here, the color brown. And the Slovaks called this Slovakia among themselves, Slovensko, but that was not an official name. It was not recognized officially by the Magyars or by anybody else. The Magyars referred to it as Upper Hungary, which of course it was in the northernmost part of Hungary. And since I mentioned the Magyars, I should mention they were the largest ethnic group in Hungary. They're the ones in green, and they ran the show. They were the rulers. It was really the Hungarian nobility, the Magyar nobility. And nowadays, Hungarian and Magyar is understood in the West as the same thing. But in the 19th century, it was not the same thing. The Slovaks considered themselves initially as Hungarian patriots, but they were not Magyars, and they knew the difference, and so did the Magyars. But nowadays, Hungary, Magyar, it's considered synonymous, but it was not in the 19th century. So anyways, this is where the Slovaks came from, the northernmost part of the Kingdom of Hungary. And they had been there since the 11th century. And they will be there until 1918, when the empire will fall apart as a result of the First World War, and a new state called Czechoslovakia will emerge, among other states that will emerge. Okay, so that gives you the background. The other thing I wanted to mention is the people in the empire, the serfs, were not freed from serfdom until 1848. Which is very, very late for Europe. In Western Europe, serfdom died out in the 15th and 16th centuries, but in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Austrian Empire, serfdom survived until 1848, which is very, very late. And that means that the social structure and the country itself, especially the Kingdom of Hungary, will be very backward as compared to Western Europe. Which is highly industrialized. So why did the Slovaks leave their homeland? Well, basically, when they were freed in 1848, they ended up, those who had land ended up, or had worked land in the past for nobles, ended up with an average of 5 hectares of land. And that was not enough to support a family. So they were desperate. As soon as they were freed, they had to start looking for work elsewhere. And many, many Slovaks started wandering south into the rich lowlands of Hungary, finding work on noblemen's estates, especially spring, summer, and fall. And they had to earn extra money, otherwise they wouldn't have made it. Some of them also wandered to Austria, the Austrian half of the empire, looking for work. So they were wandering all over the place looking for work. And this continued until the 1870s. And before we get to that, though, I want to go to the next slide and show you how mountainous Slovakia is. If any of you have been to Slovakia, you know how mountainous it is. This brown area is all mountains and forests. And there are only two portions of Slovakia where you can say it has rich agricultural land, and that's in the extreme west here in the Bratislava region, and the extreme east in what used to be called Zemplín County. Incidentally, if you've ever heard of Tokaj wine, the Slovaks make Tokaj wine in Zemplín County. They also make regular white and reds in the western part of the country. So those are the two rich regions, agriculturally speaking, and the rest of Slovakia was very poor because it was very mountainous. And as you know, it's very hard to grow crops on mountainsides. The only thing that will grow there in any quantity is potatoes. And Slovakia, as a result, has a very strong potato culture. Now, in the 1870s, all of a sudden, a bunch of agents appeared. Let me just go to here from the United States of America. These agents came from what used to be called the industrial triangle of the United States, because by the 1870s, the United States was heavily industrializing right after the Civil War, and coal mines were being opened up in huge quantities, and also steel mills were being built in very large numbers. And also, thanks to Mr. Rockefeller, oil was being produced in very large quantities. And those three industries were concentrated here in the Northeast. If you go from Boston, say, down to Detroit, but also jump over the lake to Chicago, and then back to Baltimore, that was what used to be called the industrial triangle of the United States. That's where the heavy industry was concentrated, and that's where cheap labor was needed. Because if you know anything about industrialists or capitalists, you know that they always want the cheapest labor. They want to always pay the lowest wages. That's how they make their money. And the problem that they faced by the 1870s is that the supply of cheap labor from Western Europe had dried up. The most recent supply of cheap labor that they had was from Ireland, and the Irish came in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And by the 1870s, even though the Irish supplied the cheap labor before the Civil War, after the Civil War, the Irish started to organize into unions and were demanding higher wages. And of course, the industrialists didn't want to pay higher wages. So they sent agents to Europe to see where they could find cheaper labor than the Irish. And let me go back. They went to Eastern Europe. And this region, Austria-Hungary, and also Poland to the north, which didn't exist, but it was part of the Russian Empire, and also Serbia and Montenegro and Bulgaria and Romania, which were then part of the Ottoman Empire, they all had cheap labor, okay? Because when, for instance, the Slovaks who were living in northern Hungary, when they went down into the lowlands to work for the Hungarian nobles, they were paid on average 40 cents a day. However, the agents who came from the United States, among these people, and discovered that there was this huge pool of cheap labor available, the agents promised them $1.50 a day, which was fantastic when you consider that all they could make in the old country was 40 cents a day, if they could find work. And so they lured a few of these people. They actually paid their way. They gave them the steamship tickets and also the railway tickets and whatnot in order to enable them to get to the United States, and after which they would have to pay them back. But they started luring people from, especially the eastern part, the Kingdom of Hungary, to come to America and to work as in the mines and the mills and the factories and so on. And of course, $1.50 a day was an awful lot of money compared to what they were making at that time. So they started moving. They started moving to the United States, and they moved in what we've discovered were chain migration. In other words, if somebody from a village went to America and got there successfully and started making money and started sending money home to his family or to his friends, well, then other members of his family or friends would also start moving from that same village or the neighboring village, and they would move to America in village chains. Okay, so let's go to the next one. These I've shown you. Oh, I should also point out that Slovakia, until 1918, was broken up into 16 counties, each one with a county government. And the vast majority of Slovaks who came, 2/3 of them who would come before World War I, would come from the easternmost part of Slovakia, from the Spiš, County Spiš here, Šariš, Zemplín, and Už, the county of Už. These 4 counties. These were the poorest counties of Slovakia at that time. This is where there were the most people with very little land or no land who were desperate for work. And therefore, it was from here. 2/3 of Slovaks who would move to the United States before World War I would come from these counties: Spiš, Šariš, Zemplín, and Už. And this is what a typical Slovak village looked like in the late 19th century. This is actually a museum now in eastern Slovakia, near the city of Bardejov. The Slovaks call it a skanzen. They stole that word from the Norwegians, who were the ones who pioneered these reconstructed villages. And they took the word skanzen. And what you see here on the left is a compound house, meaning that the people who inhabited this village were a family. The family lived here. Here's the door, and here are their 2 little rooms that they lived in. The rest of it, separated by a wall, was for the animals, if they had any animals, for the cows, the pigs, the horses, and whatnot. But it's a compound house, all under one roof. And this little house over here was called a summer kitchen. When things got hot in the summertime and the housewife didn't want to heat up the whole house by cooking inside, she went to cook in this summer kitchen, which kept the house cool. And in the background here, you see a Greek Catholic church. It's either Greek Catholic or Orthodox, I'm not sure. It has 3 bars across the top. And it's not always clear when you go to a village and you see a church with 3 bars, whether it's Greek Catholic or Orthodox. But in the 19th century, the vast majority of the churches were in fact Greek Catholic. Some of them became Orthodox later during the communist era, but that's another story. And over here is a barn. Okay, so this is what a typical East Slovak village would look like in the 19th century. Okay, and I already showed you this map, North America, which of course you all know. And I showed you the industrial triangle. This is where they went. And by the way, if you look a little north of the Great Lakes, you'll also notice that southern Ontario is very highly industrialized. And in a sense, it's also part of the industrial triangle. And quite a few Slovaks will also move later on, after World War I, to this industrial triangle in Canada. But that's another story. Okay? So, all right, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, one of the earliest places that the Slovaks found work was in the coal mines in the United States. And this is a picture essentially of Pennsylvania showing the 2 kinds of coal in Pennsylvania. Some of you may know this already. In the east were the anthracite fields, and in the west were the bituminous fields. The anthracite coal, which is not much used anymore, but in the 19th century, it was the favorite fuel to heat American homes, because it's very hard coal. It's hard to light, but once you get it lit, it's very hot, and it produces a clean flame as opposed to bituminous coal, which is soft and smoky and does not produce as clean a flame as anthracite. So the Slovaks started going to both the anthracite fields here in eastern Pennsylvania or the bituminous fields in western Pennsylvania, and they go all the way to Illinois. In fact, one of the oldest Slovak settlements is in Illinois, and we'll talk about that a little later. But that's one area where they would find work. Generally speaking, they would work 10 hours a day for 6 days a week, and they were paid according to how much they produced, which, from our perspective nowadays is exploitation. But the Slovaks didn't regard it as exploitation. They were happy that they could work as long as possible in order to earn as much money as possible so that they could return home as soon as possible. because initially it was single young men who came to work in these mines. And the whole idea was, I'm going to earn $1,000. With $1,000, I'm going to return home. I'm going to buy land, and I'm going to become a prosperous peasant. That was the dream. Okay, so single young men then came first, and they came to both the anthracite fields and to the bituminous fields, depending on which agents got to them first. Here's a shot of what coal mining work was like around 1890. It was dirty and dangerous work with virtually no safety measures whatsoever required of the workers. And generally speaking, 2,000 miners were killed in the mines every year in the 19th century. That's how bad it was. Many of them, of course, also got black lung disease in their old age, and they died early and so on. But this is what it was like. So this is a shot of coal miners around 1890, very dirty and dangerous work. The mine owners had to provide some kind of shelter for these workers. And this is an example of shanties, which were built by the coal companies for the miners in the early years. Very small, as you can see. And also you see a cow here, because the workers also started raising their own animals. And also they would have a garden in the back behind the little shanty. They would grow a garden, a vegetable garden. And the coal mining towns, some were not even towns, they were just called places, but they were full of these shanties. And in the early years, they had to pay rent to the owners of the shanty. They had to buy groceries from the company store. So it was basically run by the company. And initially they were very much in debt to the company. They had to pay off their voyage to America, and they had to pay rent and so on and so forth. It was a very tough life, and it didn't get better until later on, when their girlfriends or wives were called by the men to come to America. But that happened a few years later. That didn't happen right away. I wanted to show you also a steel mill shanty. No, sorry, a steel mill. First of all, this is what the steel mills looked like in the 19th and 20th centuries. This one happens to be the Gary Works, just south of Lake Michigan. And this is what a steel mill shanty in Braddock, Pennsylvania looked like, although later, a few years later. And this is what the shanties looked like when the wives or the girlfriends started coming over, because the husband would say to them, look, there are so many Slovaks living here and they have no place to live. Some of them are living in railroad cars. Why don't we open a boarding house like other ethnic groups did in the past, and you can take care of these boarders, okay? So this is now a much bigger shanty, where the housewife could have anywhere from, let's say, 4 to 16 boarders, depending on how many rooms there were and how many she could pack into one room. Needless to say, there were bunk beds in all the rooms, and usually she could fit in at least 4 boarders, if not 6, into one room. And then, yeah, this is what the oil refineries looked like. This is a refinery in New Jersey. I'm not sure what town it's in. And here I should mention that even though oil was initially discovered in Western Pennsylvania, and eventually John D. Rockefeller came to control the whole thing from Cleveland, and his initial headquarters were in Cleveland, New Jersey passed a law sometime around 1900 whereby they abolished taxes on oil refineries and various other industries, and therefore encouraged the oil businessmen to move everything to New Jersey. And Rockefeller did it. He moved everything to New Jersey, and Standard Oil became Standard Oil of New Jersey in New Jersey. And that's also why a lot of Slovaks went to New Jersey, because they went to work in these refineries as well. And I couldn't find a picture of old housing near an oil refinery, so I had to make do with this, which shows housing around a contemporary oil refinery. And you can see it's not a very pleasant place to live. None of the shanties were pleasant places to live, whether they were near mines, whether they were near mills, or whether they were near oil refineries. Not a happy place to live. I should also mention that when it comes to steel mills, these workers in steel mills, they were the worst off of those three kinds of workers that I mentioned, because steel mills, well into the 20th century, well into the 1920s, steel mills required workers to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Can you imagine? 7 days a week. They didn't have a day off. And what would happen is on Sunday, they would change shifts from day shift to night shift. And so they had to work 24 hours straight. And that's when most of the workers were killed in the mills. Same number as for the mines. Approximately 2,000 steel mill workers were killed in the mines or in the mills around, say, 1900. It was a terrible place to work. Now we can get into how they actually lived. Okay. In all of these places, whether it was a mining town or a steel town or an oil refinery town, they were always surrounded by saloons. Those saloons were everywhere. And the reason why there were saloons surrounding all of these places is that after an exhaustive 10 or 12-hour day, the workers, as you can imagine, were very thirsty, and not just for water. They wanted either hard liquor or beer. First of all, beer, and then maybe some hard liquor to go with it, and then maybe some more beer. And so with the Slovaks, this is an old tradition that came over from the old country, in the sense that in the Kingdom of Hungary, the nobility had a monopoly on the manufacture and sale of alcohol. So that average Joe couldn't manufacture or sell it. The nobility had a monopoly on it. And of course, no nobleman is going to work with his own hands, right? So the nobleman would then lease the manufacture and the sale of alcohol largely to Jews who were living in the Kingdom of Hungary or had recently come from Galicia. They were moving from Galicia to Hungary. And the Jews then ran the saloons. And the Jews then sold the liquor to the local villagers. And many of the local villagers would also borrow money from these Jewish saloon keepers and get themselves into debt. And this will eventually lead to the rise of anti-Semitism in Hungary. But meanwhile, the young men who came to North America were already used to drinking hard liquor and beer. In fact, the nobles were so perfidious that quite often the nobles who employed the Slovaks who came down from the mountains to work on the lowlands in the summertime, instead of paying them with cash, they gave them a bottle of liquor, the equivalent in liquor. And what could the poor Slovak do with that bottle of liquor? He couldn't sell it, so that he could only drink it. And so one can actually blame the Hungarian nobility for getting the Slovaks hooked on liquor. And a lot of them remained hooked on liquor when they came to North America. Anyways, the very first place they get together was in these saloons. This is where the Slovaks would meet and get to know each other. Oh, the other thing I should mention that made the saloons attractive is not just the liquor that was sold there, but American food became very, very cheap in the second half of the 19th century, as you had these huge cattle drives coming up from Texas, going to, say, Kansas City or to Chicago to be slaughtered, because by the 1870s, the refrigerated railroad car had been invented, which means that this beef, which was being produced in huge quantities in the American West, could now be slaughtered and shipped back to the East. And American beef became very, very cheap. In 1910, I remember reading in an ad in a Slovak newspaper from 1910 that you could buy a pound of beef for $1. $1 got you a whole pound of beef. Okay, and when you consider that the workers were paid, no, I said that wrong. 10 cents. No. It wasn't $1. It was 10 cents for a pound of beef. Okay, and since the workers earned between 12 and 14 cents an hour, it was affordable. Beef was affordable. And many of the letters that I read from America, when the workers were writing back to the old country, they used to brag that they could have steak for breakfast, which in the old country was unheard of. Peasants never even ate steak. Only the nobility ate steak. And in America, you could have a steak for breakfast. That was another draw. So I wanted to mention that because these saloons that you see here, this picture, usually once a week they put out a huge smorgasbord of food, and all you had to do was buy yourself a beer for 5 cents, and you could eat all the food you wanted. That was one way that they drew in more people into the saloon, by having these smorgasbord of free food. And some of the early Slovak immigrants, especially the writers who had a hard time finding work, they went to these saloons when they had those smorgasbords, and when they filled themselves, of course, with food, and when the bartender wasn't looking, they filled their pockets with food, and that's how they got extra pockets for tomorrow, so that they wouldn't go hungry the next day. So anyway, this was the first meeting place of the young men, and the second meeting place would be the boarding house. This is a picture of a boarding house in America, circa 1900. I don't know where it is. It wasn't identified when I pulled it off the internet. But this was obviously a big boarding house. Look at all those men, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. There might be 20 of them. That was a very large boarding house, okay? But boarding houses also became very important because that's where the men stayed relatively cheaply. And these boarding houses became available to Slovaks only once the young men decided, I'm not going back to the old country, I'm going to stay here. And that's when they would send for a girlfriend if she was they already had a girlfriend in Slovakia, or a wife if he had already married a wife. They would send for them, and they would come over, and they would live in this boarding house. And the women, as I mentioned earlier, could take in anywhere from 4 to 16 boarders, depending on how big the boarding house was and how much room she had. These women then cooked for the men. They packed their lunch pail for them, so they would have something for lunch. They washed their laundry, and much to the horror of American observers, these women also washed the coal dust from the back of the men when they were taking a bath, because the miners couldn't reach their backs, right? So the women washed, and I read some articles in American periodicals from this period, how American women, no, I shouldn't say women, how American genteel folk were horrified by the fact that these women were washing the men's backs when they were taking a bath. Anyways, the women also had children. The average Slovak family around 1900 had 7 children per family. Can you imagine? 7 children per family. Once the children were sent off to school, the wives, of course, supervised the homework, because you have to remember the husband was gone 10 to 12 hours a day, and then straight to the saloon. And he'd only come home after a couple of hours in the saloon. So basically the women had to supervise the children's homework. Also, the women served as matchmakers. Since most of the men they had under their supervision were single young men usually, it was the women who fixed them up with their girlfriends back in the home village, and who had them write to the girlfriends, or who wrote to the girlfriends and said, come on over, I got just a guy for you to marry. And so then the women started coming. Okay, and so quite often the housewives then served as matchmakers, and when it was successful and the couple married and had children, usually the wife and the husband became the godparents of the children of that couple whom they had brought over. Another thing that the women did was they quite often held the boarders' money. Initially, the boarders didn't know about banks, didn't trust banks, didn't speak English. So they basically asked the housewife to hold their money for them, and she did. She became sort of an amateur banker. And by doing all of this, women from Slovakia acquired great authority in the United States, much more authority over the household than they had ever had back in the old country. Because, of course, back in the old country, it was a very patriarchal society. In America, it became more matriarchal. It never became fully matriarchal, but the women essentially acquired much more authority and became more or less equal to their husbands in America. And the women, generally speaking, from what I read, took in boarders for about 20 years. And after 20 years, they had had enough. And if they no longer needed boarders, all right, because the kids were growing up and the kids were now working, and they could make it on the husband's salary. Or if they couldn't, then the women would get a job in, let's say, a cigar factory or in a textile factory. The point I'm making here is the Slovak American women, and this is true of all Eastern European women, where we were talking about Poles or Hungarians or Croats or Serbs or whatever. They all worked. These East European women all worked. They were not just what we now call housewives, okay? They all worked. And because they worked all their lives, the whole business of women's liberation passed them by. They didn't need liberating from being just housewives, as the expression used to be. They actually worked all their lives. Now, one of the drawbacks of working in the United States for these East Europeans was that there were no social welfare services whatsoever when they started coming. In fact, the United States didn't develop a social welfare system until the 1930s under FDR. So if you were one of these poor workers and you fell ill, or you suffered an accident, or you died, too bad. Nobody paid you any compensation. You were on your own, okay? And the Slovaks very quick, like other ethnic groups, very quickly discovered this and decided, we're going to have to help ourselves. Since nobody from the government will help us or from our employer will help us, we have to help ourselves. And so they decided to establish what are now called fraternal-benefit societies. And here's a picture of one of them. The Slovaks had tried to establish fraternal-benefit societies back in the old country, but the Magyar rulers basically very severely constricted what they could do. They didn't want the Slovaks to have their own societies because they were trying to forcibly assimilate them. But nevertheless, there were fraternal benefit societies already in the United States among other ethnic groups, especially among the Poles and the Czechs who had come earlier. And the Slovaks very quickly established contacts with both the Poles and the Czechs who had come earlier. In fact, they had lived in Polish or Czech boarding houses before there were Slovak boarding houses. And so they also learned from them. The Poles already had fraternal benefit societies. The Czechs already had fraternal benefit societies. So the Slovaks decided to establish fraternal benefit societies. They established initially local societies only in one little place or one little town. But finally, they decided that wasn't enough because if you were only local, you had very little money in the treasury. However, if you became national, then you could pool all your resources and have much more money in the treasury, and you could pay more. And that's what they started to do. They started to organize themselves into national fraternal benefit societies. The first one, and we have an example here on this slide, was the National Slovak Society, which was established in 1890. And this slide shows when they established a junior branch. In other words, here's the senior branch, here are the men, and you'll notice they're all in uniform. most Slovak fraternal benefit societies had their own uniforms. So here are the men, and down here are the boys. And they're just establishing a junior branch of the Fraternal Benefit Society in Westfield, Massachusetts. This is from 1913. Okay, and you also notice they have a banner, a lodge banner, and then they also have a sash. Okay, so this is what the Fraternal Benefit Societies looked like around the year 1900. The first was the National Slovak Society. The next one was the First Catholic Slovak Union, Jednota, also 1890. The Lutherans among the Slovaks established the Slovak Evangelical Union in 1893. Then a group of Slovak nationalists called the Sokols established their national society in 1896. The Catholics among them established the Slovak Catholic Sokol in 1907. And basically, now if you fell ill, your society would give you a certain amount of money for every day that you missed from work. Or if you broke an arm or a leg, they would support you for the period of time that you could not work. Or if you died, then they paid your family a death benefit. These are the three major things that they did. After the women started coming, they too wanted their own societies, because if you look at this picture, you notice it's all men. The men initially excluded women from their societies. They were only men's societies initially. So the women started to organize themselves. And in 1892, the women whose husbands belonged to the National Slovak Society established their own. They called it the Živena, which was named for an ancient Slavic goddess of life, 1892. And also the women who were the wives of the men who founded the First Catholic Slovak Union in 1890, they established their own First Catholic Slovak Ladies Union in 1892, and so on. And they also eventually established children's auxiliaries. And these fraternal benefit societies were more or less the backbone of the Slovak communities in the United States of America. I remember when I was doing my research on Slovaks in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there were approximately 4,000 Slovaks in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, South Bethlehem, around 1900. They had 19 lodges of fraternal benefit societies. Can you imagine? 19. So Slovaks were very much involved in fraternal benefit societies, and they still have them to this day. Their number has decreased, but their wealth has increased exponentially. Believe it or not, the National Slovak Society now has assets of $1,800,000,000. And so does the First Catholic Slovak Ladies Association, as it calls itself now. They both have over $1 billion in assets. Huge amount of money. And finally, I shouldn't say finally, the next thing that the Slovaks established was parishes. Most Slovaks who came to North America in the 19th and early 20th centuries were basically church going. Whether they were Catholics, Lutherans, Greek Catholics, or Calvinists, they were church going. They wanted to have their own parishes in which they could worship. And among the Roman Catholics, who made up about 75% of the Slovaks, the first two parishes founded by Roman Catholics in the United States were in Streator, Illinois, in the bituminous coal mining area, and in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. They were founded in 1884, in December of 1884. And those two parishes have been arguing with each other ever since as to which was the first Slovak parish in America. I tend to go with St. Stephen's Parish in Streator, Illinois. Notice they initially called it Slavish. Not that the Slovaks called it Slavish, but the Americans called it Slavish. They didn't know who Slovaks were. They knew there was some exotic group from Eastern Europe, that they were Slavs and so on. So they called them Slavish. This is a postcard, by the way, that some businessman was peddling in Streator. But anyways, so the Slovaks founded their first parish and in Streator in 1884. And so did the Lutherans. Slovak Lutherans established their first church or parish in Streator, Illinois, same year. And if you look at the right here, this is what most of the earliest Slovak churches looked like. Initially, when they built them, they were small and they were built of wood. They couldn't afford to build a fancy church yet. So whether we were talking about Roman Catholics or Lutherans or Greek Catholics or anybody else, the initial churches were like this. They were built of wood, they were small, and only later, when the community grew bigger and wealthier, could they afford to build themselves a decent, big church like this on the left. Okay? So whenever you look at Slovak parishes, it always starts out small like this, and then it becomes big. Now, let me see if I can find another one here. No, we're not going to the newspapers yet. Let's go back to the parishes. Okay. Now, here I want to tell you a few stories about establishing parishes in America, because this was a very turbulent part of the history of American Slovaks. And this turbulent history has largely been forgotten by American Slovaks. They don't realize what they went through in establishing these parishes. Basically, what happened is a group of laymen would get together, let's say in a saloon. Where else do you meet, right? Unless they already had a hall built by the fraternal-benefit societies, but that usually came later. Anyways, they would get together and say, you know what, guys? We haven't been to church in a long time because we don't have a church where we have a priest who could address us in our own language. Some of them went to, if there was a Czech parish nearby, they went to a Czech parish, or if there was a Polish parish nearby, they went to a Polish parish where they could understand most of the service. However, if they tried to go to the Irish parish, they were usually kicked out. The Irish didn't want them. In fact, once again, I remember when I was interviewing old-timers in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the old-timers told me that when they first went to the Irish parish, the Irish who were already in the church would not let them sit in the pews. They had to stand at the back during Mass. And as soon as the Mass ended, they had to run home because the Irish kids would start throwing stones at them. That's the kind of reception they got in the Irish parishes. Okay? But meanwhile, the men would get together in a saloon. They would say, okay, it's time, there are enough of us in town. It's time for us to now establish our own parish where we can have our own Slovak priest. So they would buy a lot somewhere in that neighborhood, their neighborhood. They would buy a lot, an empty lot. They would excavate it themselves, put in a cellar. Then they would build initially a wooden church on top, get everything ready. And once it was ready to go, they would send for a priest to the old country. They would write to the old country. They would either write the bishop of their diocese if they knew that's how to get a priest, or they would put an ad in the Slovak newspaper in the old country saying, wanted, one Roman Catholic priest to serve such and such a parish in America, guaranteed annual income, $500. And all of a sudden, priests started coming from Slovakia, responding to these ads. And they would show up. And once they showed up, the priests knew that they couldn't function in a new diocese unless they had the permission of the local bishop to function in that diocese. So they would have to go to the local bishop, usually with a translator, an American Slovak, because the priest didn't know any English. And the translator would, once they were admitted to the bishop's residence or to his office, the translator would then translate for the priest and basically introduce him and say, Your Excellency, here is Father Novak, who has just come from Slovakia to serve our parish. And the bishop would look at those two guys and say, who the hell are you? I'm not sure he would use that term, but that's what he meant. Who are you and where'd you come from? And who gave you permission to invite a priest into my diocese? The bishop would initially be very annoyed, okay? And then it all depended on how the layman handled the situation, whether they were outraged by the bishop, this Irish bishop, and most of the bishops in America, by the way, were Irish in the 19th century, whether they were outraged or whether they were deferential. If the priest and the layman translating him for him were deferential, then they might get a good dressing down from the bishop, who would explain to them that this is not how you do things. And if you want a priest from the old country, you first have to ask the bishop in the diocese in America to send a letter to the old country requesting priests. It would have to be done bishop to bishop, and the bishop would get a choice, the American bishop, in whom he would invite and authorize, and so on and so forth. Most of the time, it didn't work out that way. Well, most of the time, it turned into a huge problem. And the problem had to do with who controlled the finances in the parish and who controlled the priest. Okay? Because in the old country, the tradition was, and in fact, this had been going on for about 1,000 years, it was usually people with money, i.e. the nobility, or a bishop himself, or a city council, a town council, people with money, who would establish a church. And they became the patrons of that church. Since they paid for it, they became the patrons, which means they then paid the salaries of the priests. And they had a say in either the appointment of a priest or in his being fired. They had a say, the patrons had a say. It was called lay patronage. And the Irish already ran into trouble with German immigrants, because way back in the 1820s, there were already quite a few Irish in America, but there were also quite a few Germans, German Catholics from the south of Germany. And the German Catholics brought this idea of lay patronage to America with them, and they demanded control over the parish finances and also over the priest. And by then, the Irish already dominated the hierarchy, and the Irish said no. The Irish didn't like that system. They didn't have it back in the old country. They considered it a threat to their authority, and therefore they basically condemned lay patronage as early as 1829. There was the first Council of Baltimore condemned lay patronage and said, no, this will not do for America. But the later immigrants who came, the Slovaks, the Poles, Hungarians, whatever, after the Civil War, they didn't know about this stuff. They knew about lay patronage in the old country, so they tried to continue to practice lay patronage in the United States of America. And this would lead to terrible clashes with the Roman Catholic hierarchy in America. And here I'm going to talk about our friends, the Rusyns, who also were coming in the 1880s and 90s to America and settling basically in the same neighborhoods as the Slovaks. And in fact, they knew each other from the old country. Quite often, they came from the same village, which was a mixed village of Slovaks and Rusyns. In fact, in Minneapolis, when I studied the earliest records of Minneapolis, the Slovaks established a fraternal-benefit society, the St. Cyril Methodius Society in Minneapolis in 1888. And in it, they referred to our brothers, the Rusyns, who were also members of that society. Anyways, the Rusyns got a jump on the Catholics in the sense that the Rusyns were the first to invite their own priest from the old country. The Rusyns in Minneapolis wrote a letter to the Bishop of Prešov, the Greek Catholic Bishop of Prešov, and asked him to send a priest to Minneapolis to serve the Rusyns in Minneapolis. Well, he came. His name was Father Tot, Alexis Tot. He was a widower. This is important. He was a widower because the Greek Catholics were allowed to be married, unlike the Roman Catholics. Okay, so he was a widower. He was actually fairly high up in Prešov. He had been the chancellor to the bishop, the Greek Catholic bishop in Prešov. And when he came to Minneapolis, he knew that he had to go to the local archbishop, in this case, to accept him to work in his diocese. And he went with a translator to visit Archbishop Ireland. Notice the name, Archbishop Ireland. he went to see Archbishop Ireland to get his permission to serve the Russians in Minneapolis. And in his discussion through a translator with Archbishop Ireland, Todt happened to mention that he was a widower. And when Ireland heard that, he blew his stack. What? And he even said, I've already told Rome, don't you dare send me priests like this from Europe. I don't want priests like this. In other words, he doesn't want Greek Catholics, because Greek Catholics had the right to marry. And of course, Archbishop Ireland and the whole Roman Catholic hierarchy could not marry, or no, I shouldn't say hierarchy, priests, they were forbidden to marry. So that meeting went very badly. And as a result, Todt went back to his parishioners and told them what had happened. And the parishioners basically said, the hell with that Irishman. You don't need his permission. You can be our priest. We accept you. But Todt knew the rules and regulations of the church, and he felt uneasy serving them since he didn't have the permission of Archbishop Ireland. But Todt did some research, or some of his parishioners told him that there was an Orthodox bishop in San Francisco. And he was there because he had actually been posted up to Alaska, which had been a Russian colony. And you may remember the Russians sold that colony to the Americans. I think it was during or after the Civil War. They sold Alaska to the United States. And the bishop didn't like it up in Alaska because it was too cold. So he moved down to San Francisco. Okay. But he was a Russian Orthodox bishop, now stationed in San Francisco, and Todt went to go see him, and he asked him if this Orthodox bishop, would recognize him as part of his archdiocese, I guess. And the archbishop said, yes, but you and your flock have to return to the Orthodox Church, because the Greek Catholic Church has only existed in Hungary since, I think it was 1664, if I remember correctly. That's when a group of Jesuits converted a lot of Orthodox Russians back to the Roman Catholic Church. And the deal was that they could keep their Eastern rites. They could keep everything they had, except they had to recognize the Pope as the supreme head of the church. That was called the Union of Uzhhorod. And the Greek Catholics agreed, and that's how the Greek Catholic Church arose in the Kingdom of Hungary. And Father Todt was part of that Greek Catholic Church. So, anyways, the Orthodox bishop said to him, "You have to return to Orthodoxy, and I will recognize you." And so he came back to Minneapolis and told his parishioners, and they said, "Okay, we'll go back to Orthodoxy." And that led to a great schism in the United States between the Greek Catholic Church, which eventually was recognized as a separate church in America, and Orthodox churches, various Orthodox churches. So good old Archbishop Ireland was responsible for this great schism between the Greek Catholics in North America and the Orthodox. Meanwhile, there were many other clashes. I'll just happen to mention one of them. And that was, there was a priest named Father Jankola, who was serving his parishioners in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. And Jankola had a problem in the sense that in the old country, it was the custom that the local school teacher was also the church organist. And that's what they had going in Hazleton. They had a Slovak from the old country who was the organist and also the teacher, the school teacher. But the layman in Hazleton wanted to separate these two functions. Organist is one person, teacher is another person. Father Jankola refused. So one day while he was not at home, this was a mining town, by the way. One day when he wasn't home, Hazleton, his parishioners, some of them, they had access to dynamite, and they blew up his rectory. So when he got home that day, all of a sudden there was no more rectory. So he got the message, it's time to leave. Okay. And he went on to another parish in Bridgeport, Connecticut, founded a new parish, St. Cyril Methodius. There were many, many instances like that. I don't have time. I've already run over time. But what I used to say to my students when I taught at Cleveland State, when I was telling these stories about the early immigrants and the problems they had in the parishes, I reminded them that grandpa was a radical. Okay, unlike your parents, I would say to my students, grandpa was a radical. Because in almost every single, and I've studied quite a few Slovak parishes, maybe 20 of them, there was always a problem in the first generation between the lay trustees, as they called themselves, and the priest and or bishop. And the bishops basically ordered the priests, once they were there, you tell the lay people that you're in charge, you're the boss. You're not going to have them boss you around. But quite often the lay people said, to hell with this, and they kicked out the priest. They kicked them out and brought in another priest without permission from the bishop. This happened in almost every single parish in North America, whether in the United States or in Canada. In fact, just recently here in Montreal, the Slovaks brought in a priest from the old country. They didn't like him. They kicked him out. And that's that. Okay. So anyways, I don't want to stick to that because there's just too much. There's just too much. Oh yeah. Another one I wanted to quote to you is when I studied the Slovaks in Bethlehem, where they of course had a parish committee, like in every other parish. They had a priest in 1930 whose name was Father Fekete, and he had a sermon on something or other with which the lay people disagreed. So the president of the parish council, a fellow named Stefan Kokoška, got up and he said in Slovak, he yelled at him in Slovak, in Eastern Slovak, "A buď ticho, čo ty znaš?" Okay, which means, shut up, what do you know anyway? Can you imagine anybody today getting up like that in the Catholic Church and yelling at the priest? Shut up, what do you know anyway? This is what was going on in those days, okay? These laymen were very, very feisty. And it was because they built the parishes. They controlled the money, and therefore they felt that they should also control the priest. And it took an entire generation to die out before the second generation started obeying their priests. And why were they obeying their priests? Because they went to parochial school and the nuns taught them, don't fight with the priest. He's the boss. He's the head of the parish. Okay. So the second generation didn't keep up the fight, and the third generation has forgotten about it. But it was a very turbulent time in the history of Slovaks. And the last thing I wanted to mention very quickly, because I've gone over time, is that the earliest Slovaks who came, like all ethnic groups, wanted news from the old country and news about themselves. And therefore, the earliest Slovaks, a very small number of intellectuals came with them, very small number. 99% of the Slovaks who came were farmers or common laborers or whatnot. Only about 50 to 100 intellectuals came with them before World War I. These were usually either former seminarians or former school teachers who were kicked out of Hungary by the Hungarian government because the Hungarian government was trying to Magyarize them, and they refused to Magyarize. So they came to America. And of course, since they were intellectuals, they didn't go into the mines and mills. They began to publish newspapers because there was a great thirst for news from the old country. Before they established the newspaper, there were a few Slovaks working at the Austro-Hungarian consulate in Pittsburgh, and they were coming there asking, what's going on in the old country? Tell me this or tell me that. So the consulate started publishing a bulletin, just a simple bulletin, which they ran off on I forgot what those machines are called. But anyways, they ran it off on a little machine, and it was a bulletin, and they would post it on the bulletin board. And so many Slovaks came wanting to read it that eventually a few of these intellectuals decided, hey, there's a market here for newspapers among American Slovaks. And so they established, the very first one is the one on the left here, Amerikansko-Slovenské noviny. This one was established in 1886. And the next one was Slovak v Amerike, the Slovak in America, established in 1889, and then followed by many, many other newspapers. In fact, believe it or not, between 1886 and 1970, when a book was published on the subject, American Slovaks published 220 different newspapers. 220 different newspapers. And in the 1930s, when the newspapers peaked, American Slovaks published six daily newspapers. Can you imagine a daily newspaper in the Slovak language? 6 of them in places like New York City, in places like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago. Those were the big centers. Okay, so they published 220 newspapers at that, and some of these papers were weeklies initially. Eventually, some of them became dailies, and also monthlies. And they were also they were either business ventures, or they were fraternal-benefit society newspapers, or they were religious newspapers, or they were socialist newspapers. A huge variety of newspapers were published by American Slovaks in that period, 1886 to 1970. I'm sorry to say that there are only about half a dozen left. There are only about half a dozen left. In fact, this one just died. Slovak v Amerike died about two years ago. Jednota is still being published. It's in large format, and it's still being published because it's supported by the First Catholic Slovak Union, which has assets of $500 million, so they can afford to continue to publish newspapers like that. But it's only a monthly now. In fact, all the newspapers published by American Slovaks, there are only half a dozen, are all monthlies, and they're all published by fraternal-benefit societies. There are no more independent Slovak American newspapers. The last one was Slovak v Amerike, and it died about 2 years ago. It's gone. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is the divisions among American Slovaks. I've already alluded to some of them. The major division is, of course, religion. Roman Catholics, approximately 70–75%. Lutherans, approximately 15%. Greek Catholics, approximately 10%. Calvinists, approximately 5%. Okay, so that's one thing that divided Slovaks from the beginning. The other thing that initially divided them were the dialects. They came here with the different dialects from each county. Linguists have grouped these dialects into Eastern, Central, and Western Slovak dialects. And if they hadn't resolved the problem, then they might have remained divided by dialect, except that the Roman Catholic priests in America, once there were enough of them, established an organization of Slovak Roman Catholic priests, and they had a meeting in Philadelphia in 1903, and there they discussed this problem of the dialects, and there they all agreed that henceforth, as of 1903, we will preach only in the Central Slovak dialect, which is the official dialect that had been adopted by Slovaks back in the 19th century. And as a result, there was no more preaching in Eastern Slovak after 1903. It was all in Central Slovak. The other major issue that divided the Slovaks was nationalism or lack of it. In other words, when they came to America, they realized, there were so many different ethnic groups here, and they were organizing themselves. And the question was, what is our identity? Are we Hungarians? Are we Slovaks? Or are we Czechoslovaks? Because there was also a movement in the late 19th century to unite the Czechs and Slovaks into a new state, and theoretically into a new ethnic group called Czechoslovak. And by the time the war broke out in 1918, the Slovak community was divided into a minority who preferred to identify themselves as Hungarian, and they had a small number of priests, 10 priests who insisted that they were Hungarian, whereas there were something like 90 other priests who said, no, we're Slovak. And finally the Czechoslovak, but that doesn't become relevant until after World War I, once Czechoslovakia is created. And I can either stop it here or I can get into the Pittsburgh Agreement. Do any of you want me to do with that? Finish it with the Pittsburgh Agreement? Well, very briefly, during the war, the leadership of the Slovak community in the United States, who were organized in the Slovak League of America, which was founded in 1907, basically met with Czechs twice. First in Cleveland in 1915, where they agreed with the American Czechs that they were going to work together to destroy Austria-Hungary and to create a new republic called Czechoslovakia, which would be a federal state, and that was stressed in the Cleveland Agreement. And then there was a second agreement called the Pittsburgh Agreement. I have a copy of it here. It's in Slovak. And this one won out over the Cleveland because this one was signed by the leader of the movement to create Czechoslovakia, T.G. Masaryk. Here is his signature. You see it right here? Okay, this was signed by T.G. Masaryk. And while this did not speak of a federal Czechoslovakia, it did hint that there would be autonomy for the Slovaks, home rule for the Slovaks, in the sense that they would have their own diet, that is parliament, that they would have their own law courts, that the language would be Slovak, and that the schools would be Slovak, and so on. Okay, so that's called the Pittsburgh Agreement. And on the basis of this, Czechoslovakia was created at the end of 1918. And this document will plague Czechoslovakia for the whole time that Czechoslovakia existed, because Masaryk repudiated it, and the Czechs who ran the state, because they outnumbered the Slovaks 3-1, also ignored it. And so the Slovaks became junior partners. They wanted to be equal partners. They became junior partners in Czechoslovakia. And as a result, they divorced. They divorced finally in 1993. And now they're the best of friends, whereas before they were constantly bickering over how much home rule the Czechs would grant them. Okay, and that's it. I'm way over time. I'm sorry about that, but I couldn't say it any faster. So now I'm open to questions, if anybody has any questions for me.
Okay, thank you, Mark. If you could stop sharing, and we can all see each other again.
Okay, there we go.
Excellent. Okay, let me see if there are any questions in the chat. I think they're all comments.
You should try to make them in the form of questions.
No, I don't see any questions.
Hello, Mark.
Here.
Mark, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You don't find Czechoslovak churches. The only one I've seen is the Czechoslovak Baptist Church.
Oh, yeah. No. There was a movement which began in Czechoslovakia that there should be a Czechoslovak church created.
Right.
Okay. And some of those people sent representatives over here to America to also create a Czechoslovak church. And there were maybe 3 or 4, but usually they were dissident churches. There had been a problem. I know of one in Philadelphia where there was a squabble, an argument between certain parishioners in the Roman Catholic Church and their priest, and they couldn't resolve it. So those parishioners broke away and established for about 40 years a Czechoslovak church, which no longer exists. It died. Okay. And there may be a few others.
And the diocese recognized it. In other words,
No. The diocese did not recognize it.
It didn't recognize it.
No. The Czechoslovak church was from the beginning considered a schismatic church.
Oh, okay.
By Rome. It was condemned by Rome. No. Because there were a lot of Czechs who were members who were Hussites, who were of the Hussite tradition.
Right.
Okay, you may remember Jan Hus had been condemned by the church and burned at the stake. So
I do recall that in Czechoslovakia, but I didn't realize that
there were a few in North America, but they didn't last. Here. They didn't last.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's a good question that was in the chat. Why did the first Carpato-Rusins and Slovaks come to Minneapolis?
Not necessarily. Minneapolis was one of the earliest settlements. No, I think they first headed to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, I forgot to mention, received fully half of all the Slovaks who came. In other words, approximately 500,000 came before World War I, and fully half settled in Pennsylvania, largely because that's where the coal mines and steel mills were.
No, but why did they come to Minneapolis then?
Because there was work in this, there was work in those flour mills.
Well, that's what they say, the flour mills, but I haven't really found any evidence that a lot of them worked in the flour mills.
I haven't done research on the Russians in Minneapolis. I don't know. I don't know where they initially worked.
Okay, thanks.
That's for you to research, Karen.
Yeah.
Now, I've been trying to find it out. Actually, I've got a lot of it from the Carpatho-Rusins from St. Mary's Church, their fraternal organization. I've got a whole bunch of medical slips that they had to submit for them to get paid. And one of my projects eventually is to look at where they worked.
Yeah, well, St. Mary's should have a list of their earliest parishioners. Have you looked at that list?
Oh yeah, I know who they are. I know who they are, but why they came, it's the why did they come to Minneapolis that I don't know.
I suspect that some agent got to them and lured them to Minneapolis and promised them work, but what kind of work, I don't know.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah, I do know that a lot of Slovaks also worked in the railroads, because I always remember reading about Slovaks getting killed on railroads, and also and many employed there. Also warehouses they worked at.
Railroads were big in Minneapolis, and a lot of them did
Yeah.
work on the
Yeah.
railroads, but not initially, I don't think. That wasn't their first job here.
Ken has a question.
Mark?
Yeah.
Mark, this is Ken Bombera. You talked about the newspapers and Slovak publications and so forth. And perhaps you could just share an information. You, for many years, edited the excellent academic journal Slovakia. And I was just sort of wondering, I hadn't heard anything recently, whether that was still going to be published or not. Was there anything you could share, about that?
Sure. Unfortunately, the Slovak League, as far as I know, died a couple of years ago.
Oh.
They ran out of money. And the last time I talked to Daniel Tanzoni, who was the last president,
Right.
I asked him, should I do another issue of Slovakia? He said, no, we don't have any more money. So
Yeah.
Slovakia died. The last issue was 2021.
2021, yeah.
2021. And by the way, we have a new member of the Slovak Studies Association, who is the associate director of the University of Iowa Libraries. And he's half Slovak, and he's a gung-ho, pro-Slovak and all that. And he, on his own initiative, has digitized. He's digitized every single issue of Slovakia from its first appearance in 1951 until 2021. He's digitized the whole thing. And he's also digitized the literary magazine Most, which was published by the post-war refugees after 1945. He digitized both, all on his own, without anybody paying him. It's fantastic.
So are those archives at the museum, or?
No. They're available online. They're available online. You can just type in Slovakia and boom, there it is.
Okay.
and you can type in individual issues. You can type in individual articles, book reviews. He did a fantastic job. It's all available online, and he controls it from University of Iowa Libraries.
Mark, what is his name?
Yeah, I don't remember. He doesn't have a Slovak name. That's why I always have a hard time remembering his name. If you wait a second, I'll look it up.
Okay.
I will find it immediately. Anyway, just type in University of Iowa Libraries Associate Director and his name will pop up.
Associate Director. Okay, and if you think of it afterwards, just drop me an email.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for everybody. The Yankola Library collection is going to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which was a Czechoslovak museum and archive and library. But the Yankola sisters that I've talked to, I don't think they were fully familiar with the whole collection. They sort of put it away in storage because they only had so much room and they didn't have the personnel to catalog everything. Materials that came also from the Slovakia, the Jednota Museum and Archives in Middletown. They moved that stuff there, and they also sent some to Independence, Ohio. So there's a lot of things we don't really know what's there. They still have stuff boxed up in Independence, Ohio. So there's a lot of material that has not been cataloged or recorded in any way that's there, so to speak. And, I don't know. Did anybody volunteer to go up to the Yankola Library to look at what they have?
I know what they have because I've done research there. They had the finest book collection of any center in North America on Slovaks, American Slovaks. They also have a huge number of archives, unprocessed, like you mentioned, unprocessed, like the Jozef Husek papers, who was a very important editor of Jednota and president of the Slovak League. They have his papers. They were scattered all over the place. Well, wherever they could find a cubbyhole to put something, that's where they put it.
Right.
It was very disorganized, and you've raised a very sensitive question as far as I'm concerned, which also makes me very angry, because, as I mentioned earlier, the National Slovak Society has assets of $1,800,000,000. And the First Catholic Slovak Ladies Association has assets of over $1 billion. I'm not sure how many hundreds of millions besides the billion they have. So American Slovak organizations are very rich. The fraternal-benefit societies are very rich. They have billions of dollars. And you would think that since they have billions of dollars, they could find, let's say, 20 or 30 million of those billions to establish a Slovak library and archives and museum. You would think.
Yeah, I suggested to the Czech and Slovak Museum in Cedar Rapids that they establish a branch, a satellite, a museum in Pennsylvania or Ohio, which is closer to where more Slovaks have settled, and have that collection there would be accessible to people instead of out in the middle of nowhere.
They're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's a terrible location.
I
I didn't finish, Michael. I didn't finish. I have written at least a half a dozen times to all the presidents of the Slovak Fraternal-Benefit Societies, suggesting that they pool their resources to establish a Slovak museum, library, and archives. And it's like beating your head against the wall. I got nowhere. With them, even though they're rolling in money and they're not really doing anything with the money other than giving a few $1,000 scholarships here and there. One of these days, the what do you call it? The IRS in the US will catch up with them and say to them, what are you doing with all these billions of dollars? You're supposed to be giving it away. And why aren't you giving it away? They're going to catch up with them one of these days. And I really wish that they had invested in a Slovak museum, library, and archives somewhere either in Pennsylvania or Ohio, somewhere between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. I know there would be a fight whether it should be Cleveland or Pittsburgh, but maybe they could pick Youngstown. Who knows?
Yeah, that's what I would think. Youngstown would be a good location.
Yeah, but nothing, absolutely nothing.
Property is less expensive in Youngstown.
They never even had the courtesy of answering my letters. They never had the courtesy of answering my letters. And so the Slovak stuff is now going out into the middle of nowhere, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There are virtually no Slovaks out there. And if anybody wants to study that stuff, it's very hard to even get to. Yeah, I have to fly to Chicago, and I have to wait for that one plane a day that goes to Cedar Rapids in order to go to Cedar Rapids. It's ridiculous. It's in the middle of nowhere.
Martin Javor, who has that emigration museum of people, Slovaks going to North America, was also very disturbed when he found out that that happened, and nobody consulted him.
because-
The decision was made by a committee and the Mother Superior at the Jan Kola Library.
Well, they're also dying out. The Slovak sisters are dying out.
Oh, yeah.
That's the problem. They're dying out, and they have to do something with the collection. And
Right, they were worried about preservation,
Yeah.
and that's a big problem. And I talked with several of the nuns, and the Mother Superior decided that since the Czech and Slovak Museum in Cedar Rapids is affiliated with the Smithsonian, that they would do the best job of preserving what they had.
Well, but it's not good for the Slovaks because it's in the middle of
No.
nowhere.
Right.
That's the problem. And also, I don't know if you know the history of that museum. It started out as a purely Czech museum when they established it back in 1975, I think. And then for some strange reason, around 1990, they turned it into a Czechoslovak museum. And then when somebody reminded them that was passé, that word was passé, then they broke up the word into Czech and Slovak. Well, I don't want to get into it because it just makes me angry. That shouldn't have happened. We should have our own institution, but American Slovaks, the leaders of the fraternals, don't seem to appreciate the value of history, preserving our history. They don't seem to appreciate that.
I found that out when I was the editor of Jednota.
Yeah, unfortunately. And that probably has to do with the fact that the vast majority of their ancestors were peasants, and they didn't come with this tradition of reverence for education and for literature and for history and so on. It's not part of our background, unfortunately.
No.
Ellen?
I'd just like to say that I agree with Mike and with Mark that it would be wonderful to have a Slovak museum / library in the East where the Slovaks lived and live. Excuse me. But like anything else in modern life, it's going to take money. And should NCSML decide that, yes, they're going to go ahead and have a branch somewhere, Youngstown or wherever, again, it's going to take money. SASW fairly recently set up an endowment, a Slovak endowment at NCSML, and we stipulated that it only be used for Slovak projects, programming, exhibits, etc. We continue to contribute to it bit by bit, and we figure if we're going to make any change out in Cedar Rapids, and God bless Cecilia, she is on the side of the Slovaks. She has really made an effort to make contacts in Slovakia and to have more Slovak programming going on. We're in an area where, yes, there are mainly Czechs living there. But anyone is eligible to, I'm going to put a shameless plug here, to contribute to the Slovak endowment at NCSML. You don't have to go through us. You can send it directly, excuse me, to Cedar Rapids. We would be very happy to see that endowment grow larger and larger and to be used for something meaningful. And if they could somehow maybe go into partnership or whatever with Slovak fraternal groups, that would be wonderful. NCSML is professionally curated, which I find more heartening than having somebody have a little museum, quote unquote, that's sort of a converted broom closet. You have to make an appointment to go there. And even then, if they can't find somebody with the keys, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing I learned recently is that there is now a direct nonstop flight to Cedar Rapids from Washington, D.C. So should you be in this area and want to go there, it's now easier. You don't have to go through Minneapolis or through Chicago, you can go directly there. It's only once a day, but it's nonstop direct.
The other institution that is going downhill fast is also the Slovak Institute in Cleveland. Once upon a time, that was a thriving and going concern.
Mhm.
It's practically dead.
Yeah, that's really a shame. And that's, again, where the fact that NCSML is Smithsonian affiliated and is run by professionals. I mean, these are museum and library professionals. I've contributed materials and I'll continue to contribute materials because I know that they will be cared for properly. They won't just be put in some cabinet and forgotten. As for the newspaper and print materials, Steve Baluk is doing, basically God's work. He's an unsung hero. He has digitized, scanned thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of old newspapers that were, some of them were literally turning to dust. Any rate,
Where is he based? Where is he based?
he actually, I believe, lives in Florida, but right now, the month of May, he's spending in Danville, clearing out the basement and the storage cubbies, looking to see what's there, getting it packed up to send to Cedar Rapids, and probably doing scanning work there as well. But I think his main objective is, because the building is being sold, that
I
he
think
needs
it's already
to
been
get.
sold.
Oh, it has been sold already?
So, yeah.
Oh, okay. So his objective, he's working against the clock to get that stuff out of there before
We have to be
somebody just
grateful
sees
that,
it and goes, oh,
we
let's
have to
just
be
put this in
grateful
the
that at
trash.
least that is going on.
Yeah.
By the way, at least it came to me that the librarian at the University of Iowa who is digitizing all this material is Paul Soderdahl. Soderdahl. Must be some kind of Scandinavian name.
Yeah. Okay, I've seen that name before.
Paul Soderdahl, he's the one.
Soderdahl. Okay.
And in fact, he's done it. He's done it.
Yeah.
And he's very friendly. If you send him an email, he'll tell you right away what to do and how to find the stuff.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, I'll see if I can get him to
Paul
give us a
Soderdahl.
call.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
But anyway, Steve Baluk had put out a call for anyone who wanted to volunteer to
What's
help
his
him for
last
the month of May.
Dave?
He's going to be there until almost the 30th. And if anybody wants to go and help him, to contact him, I can forward emails. Your room and board will be provided by the sisters, and all you need to do is bring your grubbies and be willing to help unpack, sort, reload, do whatever it is that.
There's a lot of work to be done, Mike, because I've seen that stuff.
Yeah, and Steve would be grateful for anybody
Any
to
help.
come, even for a few hours, for a few days, whatever. He would be delighted to have people come help him.
I was planning to go there, but I have to go to mass right now, so I have to leave. So bye-bye, everybody. My wife just rang the bell for me. Okay.
Okay, nice seeing you, Mike.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right.
If I could
Nice.
just see it, Michael, we'll talk, but just maybe a kind of final point on this regarding the museum in Cedar Rapids. I was on the board for about a year as a ex officio member of Friends of Slovakia, and needless to say, the Cedar Rapids, they're always sort of, Cecilia's a great fundraiser, and coming out of the university systems and so forth. But they have a big fundraising goal effort over the next couple of years, and I did know that they had been planning with they have a development team, and they had wanted to go around to the fraternals and see if they could get buy-in from the fraternals. I don't know the status of any of those efforts, but I think the concept that I believe Michael raised, I think you may have raised as well, Mark, of some type of branch of the National Museum, I think would really be a good option, and probably would be a little bit more palatable for the fraternals if they ever wanted to participate in such an effort. You could marry the professional expertise of the Cedar Rapids Museum with all the other collections that are with the fraternals and Yankola and who knows all of this. So that's obviously kind of a pipe dream at this point, but it really is probably the best option if anyone wants to pursue that, in my view, anyway. So I'll leave it at that.
And there are many other collections that we haven't even mentioned. The Catholic Sokols in Passaic have a huge collection of their own and also of Slovak American newspapers. Huge. The Ženska Jednota in Cleveland also has a very large collection, and so does the other Jednota. And you know, there is so much material out there, it can fill an entire building. And that Cedar Rapids doesn't have enough space for all that stuff.
Yeah, and they're building other facilities, like they're trying to, I think, build another building for like a TV studio and all kinds of things. So
They need another building just to hold all that stuff.
yeah, and I don't know the status anymore.
They're also expanding the current building, as well as additional freestanding space.
And there's always digitizing everything. If we could get a group together to do that, preserve it that way.
Oh yeah, we have so many newspapers. In fact, in Cleveland, at the Slovak Institute, they had a huge collection of newspapers. I don't know if whatever happened to it, but it's even bigger than the collection that I found in Passaic, New Jersey. We're talking about hundreds of volumes of newspapers that need to be digitized. And who's going to pay for that? So anyways, I wish them luck, because I have no luck whatsoever with the fraternals. None.
Yeah.
Well, are there any other questions for Professor Stolarik? There was one in the chat from Marie. What percentage of the Slovakian immigrants during this time to the US and Canada were Rusins?
Well, the Rusyns were an ethnic group onto their own. If you compare them to the Slovaks, I would say maybe 150,000 Rusyns came at that time before World War I. That would be an educated guess. I've done some reading on the Rusyns, but Paul Magochi is the expert on the Rusyns, and he's published several books on Rusyns, including Rusin Americans. So if you need information on Rusin Americans, go to Paul Magochi's publications. Magocsi, Paul Magochi. And as far as I know, they established, I didn't mention this in my lecture, but the Roman Catholic Slovaks established 240 Roman Catholic parishes, the Lutherans 90, the Greek Catholics, and those are mixed, the Rusin Slovak parishes, they established 150, and the Slovak Calvinists established 9. Now, and unfortunately, most of those parishes are now gone. They've either been closed down or they've been amalgamated with other parishes, unfortunately.
Yeah, the parish in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, is not just Slovak anymore. It's been renamed Incarnation of Our Lord.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of enveloped several other parishes in that area.
Yeah.
But at least it's still in use. It's
still there, yeah.
Still open.
But we've lost most of our parishes, and that's largely, I didn't get into this, but if you're interested, it's largely because the Irish hierarchy in North America did not like what they called national parishes. They wanted them to disappear as quickly as possible, and all of them become what they call territorial parishes. And that's happening. That's happening now. Like, as you mentioned, Bethlehem, it's now a territorial parish.
Also, a lot of those parishes closed because of lack of parishioners. You know, the old people died out.
What else happened that I noticed is that quite a few of the Slovaks, most of the Slovaks, moved out of the old neighborhoods in the cities, you know, beside the factories and whatnot, and they moved out into the suburbs.
And married non-Slovaks and
but they moved into the suburbs and they petitioned the bishops to let them reestablish their parish in the suburbs, and most of the bishops said no, go to a territorial parish. One of the few places where the bishop said yes was Detroit, because they had a Polish origin bishop there. And when the Slovaks petitioned him that they could reestablish their St. Cyril Methodius parish in the suburbs, I think it's Dearborn, he said yes. And so we have a viable Slovak parish in Dearborn. But in most other dioceses, the bishop said no.
I think they closed a lot of Catholic churches in northeastern Pennsylvania for,
Oh, yeah, a lot of our, not just Slovak, Catholic parishes are closing due to
Yeah.
declining membership.
Mhm.
But also before that, before the declining membership, they could have had a lot of ethnic parishes in the suburbs, but the bishop said no.
Okay, well, it's almost 4 o'clock. This has been fascinating, very interesting, Professor Stolarik. So I'd like to thank you for speaking to us today. And I'd like to thank everyone who came and joined us. And I want to say everyone that have a great afternoon.